The focus of this presentation is a part of an ongoing study that we're doing with the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project, focused on can we actually predict outbreaks of PRRS and PED. I first want to acknowledge that I don't do this by myself. I do this with a team. For example, Igor Poplawski, who gave a talk earlier today, he's a postdoc that worked with me, Rahul Bhojwani, who's a data science master's student, and then Gustavo Machado, who is now former postdoc, now faculty at North Carolina State University. All of these people have been very important in making this project work. And of course, we acknowledge all the participating companies in MSHMP, particularly the ones that we're piloting this particular project with, as well as the MSHMP team, which is really the engine that drives all of this work that we're able to do. And then our funders, the Swine Health Information Center, as well as USDA. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project, which we call MSHMP, it is a surveillance system for endemic diseases in the U.S., or endemic swine diseases, focusing on PRRS and PED. The types of data that is collected include weekly status for sow farms, so this is weekly infection status, whether a farm is in active infection for PRRS and PED, or if it's negative, and there's a few other statuses in there as well. And we also have information on the locations of all those farms. It is based entirely on industry participation, and right now we have about a coverage of around 45% of the U.S. sow population that is part of this program. So it's a really great example of how we can do long-term epidemiological monitoring and research, and the types of rich insights that we get by actually starting to track things both spatially and temporally over a long period of time. And so the focus of this project in particular is to say, okay, now we have this really great data set where and when breaks occur for PRRS and PED. Can we learn something about what's going on from all of this historical data that we've now accumulated, 9 years of data? Can we actually use that to actually build some sort of predictive model that says, okay, we know what conditions lead to breaks happening. Can we actually project that forward in time and actually give some sort of forecast on do we expect, a given farm to break in a given period of time? So the main components of infection risk that go into our model, of course, are movements. I think you're getting a pattern. I really like pig movement data and networks. So this is largely spatially independent data. We have these sorts of movements for. This is just an example of one production company that is, it's a moderately big company. But what you're looking at there is 1 year of data. I think it's like around 20 million pigs that have moved in, I think it was around 100,000 movements. So if you actually break it down, they have around something like 85 trucks on the road every day moving pigs around. So it's really quite astonishing how much we move pigs. You show this to people in Europe or elsewhere, and they're very surprised at the degree to which pig movement occurs in the United States. And of course, we know these movements are important for potential transmission. We also know that there are local spatial factors that are going on that also can facilitate transmission between farms. So we have a farm now up there in the middle, and that's an infected farm, and we know that there's something about being close to that infected farm that might make a farm at risk during that period of time. And we also know that proximity to an infected farm isn't the same everywhere. In some places, being 1 kilometer from an infected farm may be really bad, and in other areas, based on some aspect of the environment, the vegetation, the climate, maybe 1 kilometer doesn't mean the same thing. So we really need to start understanding the different landscape factors that are going in, that either make spatial transmission more important or less important. So essentially, the goal of this project is we want to combine all these different sources of information, all the way from the MSHMP database, pig movement, spatial data, environment, weather, actually combine that information and put it into a model that can actually help us to start quantifying and being able to predict the risk of outbreaks in sow farms. The approach we take is we call neighborhoods of risk. So if you can imagine that this blue triangle here is a sow farm located somewhere on a landscape, And what we do is we draw a circle 10 kilometers around that farm, and we say that's that sow farm's neighborhood. And we know various information about what's going on in that neighborhood. For example, we know the locations of other farms in the neighborhood and whether or not those farms are infected or not. We have information on animal movements, and importantly, not just the movements into the sow farm itself, but potentially the movements into your neighbors. If your neighbors are moving in lots of pigs, then that increases the likelihood of a local introduction of the virus, and then once it's in your neighborhood, it could get onto your farm through other kind of local area fomites, windborne, a number of things that would act at a very local scale. And then we also have information, at least for the sow farms. We know if the origin of these movements is an infected farm or not. So we have information on that as well. And then the final thing we bring in is those microenvironmental variables, what's going on at the landscape, the vegetation, the weather, and how all of those things might make it a virus more or less likely to get from this farm into your farm. So if we can quantify those things across time, then the idea is if we quantify that in, say, week 1 and week 2, can we actually predict whether a farm is going to break in week 3? So that's the essential layout of what we're trying to do. So what you're looking at is the study area. We were piloting this project. What you're looking at is each small black circle or black dot represents a farm. The farms that have circles drawn around them, those are the sow farms. So those circles are the neighborhoods. And the color of the circle, the orange ones are the ones that are actively experiencing a PED outbreak. And the ones that are not orange are not PED positive, or at least not status 1 during those time periods. So right now what you're looking at is a weekly time lapse through the course of 1 year of which farms are infected and which are not. And then the lines between the neighborhoods or between those circles represent the flows of pigs between these neighborhoods. So essentially, we have this sort of data. In total, there's about over 3,000 farms in this area. About 320 of those are sow farms. And then during the time period we have, which is 4 years, we have 321 PRRS breaks that have occurred in these sow farms and 458 PED breaks. So that's what we're actually trying to predict. So we put all this data that I was just referring to about the landscape and the neighborhoods and the movements, we put that into a machine learning model and to basically try to build a predictive model that we're going to use to do the forecasting. And I'm not going to go into details of that, but briefly we do withhold, or we use most of the data, about 80% of the data to build the model, and then we withhold 20% and test the model to see how it can predict on data that I hadn't seen before. So that's what we're doing to try to validate these models. So the types of things we get from our machine learning model is we get a ranked list of all of our variables of how important they were for their predictions, how much value was that particular variable, and be able to properly predict things. So that's what this shows. This is a ranked list. The ones at the top have more importance. The ones at the bottom didn't seem to be that important. So there's a few things I want to highlight here. First, these ones here, moderately important variables. We have first the movement into the focal farm, into our actual sow farm. Of course, that's what we expect to be risky. If you're moving pigs in, that's a risk, and that's what most network analyses focus on, is that sort of movement. But right alongside that, we have the movements of animals into your neighbor farms that are just as important in our prediction as the movements into the farm itself. And then, interestingly, what's by far the most important variable is actually of the neighboring farms, the ones that are moving pigs in, where are they getting those pigs, and did they come from an infected farm or not? So that right now seems to be the most important variable in predicting PED breaks in the sow farm. So it's the status of the source of your neighbor's movements. And then we have other things like also the status of the source of your movements, which of course would be important. And you'll see other things that we've included here. Season, we kind of expect that, so that's in there. This is just overall hog density. We have some other environmental variables like vegetation that come up as important, which matches some work actually by Andrea that we know that aspects of the landscape are quite important. So overall, more pigs moving into the neighborhood is important for higher risk. And the infection status of those sources, or the source of those movements, is very important. And then we do find an aspect of vegetation and other landscape factors important that are important. This is what it looks like if we actually look at this in space. So this is week 4. This is week 14. We see generally a high-risk blob in the high-density area of our study area. But if you actually break that down and look at the specific neighborhoods or the specific sow farms, this is week 4. This is also week 14. It's the same group of farms. You still see in general this area is a high-risk area in week 4 and week 14, as represented by those orange and red circles, but it's not necessarily the same farms that are being predicted to break in those time periods. So we think that this is a pretty potentially sensitive tool for making these sorts of calls. Just to put this in perspective, our positive predictive value is 76%, which means 76% of the time that our model is predicting, yes, there's going to be an outbreak that next week. It actually does occur. Sensitivity, though, is actually quite a bit lower. So if the model says there's going to be a break, it's pretty sure there's going to be a break, but it misses breaks as well. So we're working on the sensitivity of that, but right now that is a drawback. So these are the same results for PRRS. The previous ones were all PED. It turns out, maybe unsurprisingly, PRRS is a little bit harder to predict. So we're still working on this. So I'm not going to spend as much time on the results here. I'll just highlight that again, we see the status of the source farms of the movements are really important, both the movements into the focal farm itself as well as the movements into the neighboring farm. So where those pigs are coming from is important for being able to make these predictions. I think one reason that PRRS might be harder to predict is that it's a much more complex situation. I'm just going to do a little shout out to my postdoc Igor. He gave a talk earlier on PRRS genetic groups from the same area, and essentially there's a lot of genetic diversity of PRRS, and all PRRS is probably not created equal. This is an example of one of these lineages, these different colors or these different genetic groups, how that appears in our movement networks. And we can see that, we do know that PRRS moves through these networks. We can show that statistically, but it's not equally true for all of the different genetic groups. Some genetic groups seem to really move through the network, and then there's a few genetic groups, particularly the ones that are associated with PRRS type 1, that don't seem to move through the network to the same extent. So all PRRS is not created equal, and that could be why it's harder to predict. So the limitations of the study, as I just said, not all PRRS is the same. When we're kind of using a broad brush and calling all PRRS breaks the same, and they are caused by different viruses, and incorporating that genetic data might actually help us to better elucidate what's going on. Other limitations of our general project in terms of forecasting is data availability and the timeliness of the data. Data availability, of course, not all production systems track movements in a way that's easy to analyze. For example, if the production system keeps everything in paper records, that's not something we can very easily put in a computer. Related to that, even if a company is tracking movements, the movement is really important, is only as important as timely it is. So it's pretty easy to do this in a retrospective sense, but if we're trying to predict what's going on next week, we really need the most up-to-date movement data as possible. So if there's a 3-month or 3-week or lag before we're able to actually look at movement data, then we're not going to be able to make very good predictions because our data is already out of date. Infection data is a little bit similar to that. I think the biggest limitation of infection data is that we only have the status for sow farms, so we don't really know what's going on at the finishers and the nurseries. So they're kind of a black box for us, but we know that they probably are very important for risk for sow farms. And then we also have a number of missing pieces. So we don't really have any information about variation of biosecurity across different sites. We don't have information about are they vaccinating, how often, when. And we're not really accounting for potential alternative modes of transmission. So we have some aspects of spatial transmission, we have movement-based transmission, but we really aren't getting at, for example, other types of vehicles and personnel that are moving between sites, and we don't have any information on what they're doing, so we can't include that in the model. But my key take-home here is that we think that this kind of neighborhood-based way of looking at risk is really very valuable in actually capturing both risks associated with long-distance animal movements, but at the same time looking at local spatial dynamics and kind of unifying those into one framework. And we think that there's a lot more interesting work to do here based on different types of PRRS. Do they behave differently? But all in all, we're hoping that eventually we're going to get to that this project and these models that we're building can really form the foundation of kind of a dynamic system for actually forecasting risk. So that along with, the PRRS reports that's given as part of MSHMP, that each participant would actually get a list of their sow farms and the projected risk in the next, month for their particular sow farms. So that's kind of where we're hoping to see this going. I want to recognize our funders again, especially Swine Health Information Center, who have been extremely supportive of this work, and we very much appreciate their interest and involvement.